given that the idea of the primer series is to really start from very sort of foundational building blocks with ideas we hear all the time, I thought this topic was particularly appropriate, actually, because there are lots of terms we hear bandied about in the press and in ordinary everyday conversation that don't necessarily, I think, make sense or that aren't strictly true all the time. And so one of the things I want to do is to try and unpack some of these terms. We hear Salafi and Wahhabi used interchangeably, Takfiri and Jihadi also used. And so these are parts of the broader lexicon that I hope we'll be sort of unpacking and going through as we do the presentation today. So to start from that very sort of simplistic background, I suppose, it's worth saying that Salafis come from the sort of Sunni tradition of Islam. And of course, Muslims are broken down most broadly into Sunni and Shia Muslims. And this really stems back to schism that came about within Islam following the death of the Prophet Muhammad and was fundamentally and principally in its earliest incarnations a political difference about succession and who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad in leadership. And that sort of schism later gave rise to a number of doctrinal issues. They're not particularly worth going into per se, other than to say it's now created two fairly diverse theologies that, of course, are currently battling it out across large parts of the Levant, as we see in a particularly brutal and sectarian conflict. But the Salafis come from the Sunni side of that, and Sunnis make up about 90% of all Muslims in the world. And for the Shia, who are the sort of smaller minority here, about 10%, they're principally concentrated in terms of geographical location in Iran, in southern parts of Iraq, in southern Lebanon, in parts of Iraq as well, as I said, and Bahrain and so on. So this is really the area of sort of greatest geographical concentration for them. Who are the Salafis then, and what do they believe? Well, Salafis are one part of this broad Sunni tradition of Islam. And again, within Sunni Islam, there are a number of quite diverse traditions. So you will have heard terms like Sufi and Barelvi, Deobandi, and things like this. And these are all different ways, I suppose, of practicing Islam and of trying to realize Islam through its different traditions and legal codes and so on. And so for the Salafis, it really goes back to this idea that one of the sources of law beyond the Quran is the Hadith. And these are the recorded traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, which is taken as a source of law alongside the Quran and complements the Quran. You can think of it as being, or as offering footnotes to the guidance that exists within the Quran. And together, these two things populate the vast majority of Islamic legal codes, but not exclusively. And so within the Hadith, there's a moment when the Prophet Muhammad gets asked, who are the best amongst the Ummah? Who are the best amongst the Islamic nation? Who are the best Muslims? And he says, the generation with me, meaning the Sahaba. The Sahaba are the companions of the Prophet. And then he's asked, who are the best generation after that? And he says, the generation after them. And the best generation after them? The generation after them. And these are known as the Tabi'een and the Tabi'in. And so this three-generational spread of the Prophet's companions, their children and their children's children, are taken to encapsulate the golden era of Islam, the ultimate markers of authenticity and purity of Islamic practice. And together, they're what's known as the Salafi-Salihin, the pious predecessors. And it's them that the Salafis today attempt to emulate. It's their practice of Islam that they want to emulate. And so Salafis, in a sense, are actually people who you would see as being, I suppose, if you're walking down the street, most clearly or obviously identifiable as Muslims. For women, they tend to wear the veil, as you would see. And for men, they tend to have the long beard. And so, as I say, these are sort of visually, very clearly Muslim people. And they adhere to that side of it. For them, really progress, spiritual progress, is all about regression. It's about regressing or reverting to the Islam as practiced by the Salaf, the generations that, as I said, existed around the Prophet Muhammad and who knew him or were with him within living memory. And it's about reviving their Islam. So that's the emulation that these individuals seek to achieve. And so for them, the more you can regress from the world and move towards that kind of practice, the better Muslim you're becoming. And so in a weird way, you have a progressive movement in their own minds towards authenticity and purity through a regressive practice of belief and of action. They, as a result of that, tend to adopt slightly more literalist approaches. There's less room for for innovation and things like that. And they take a very strong line against things that they would regard as leading to anything that might innovate or dilute aspects within the faith. Now, the thing is, even with the Salafis, this is within itself a huge tradition. And this is where people get very confused, because Salafism today, particularly because of what we see in the news, gets automatically and usually pretty swiftly equated with terrorism and with violence. Yet the reality is Salafism is an incredibly broad tradition. I was going to say broad church, is probably the wrong. A broad mosque in many senses. And within it, you could basically break it down into three things, because it's important to say up front, I suppose, that within the Salafi movement, within the Salafi tradition, you can have Saudi state scholars, people who are very loyal to the Saudi government, who work with the government every day, and who issue edicts, and for whom the practice of Salafism in that country, in Saudi Arabia, is a pattern of state stability. It has delivered remarkable stability in the kingdom, in a region where stability really is placed at a premium. And then, within the same tradition, you have movements like Al-Qaeda, you have individuals like Osama bin Laden, and how do you square these people within the same broad tent? So the point is, Salafis, I think, can be broken down into three categorizations. This isn't my own categorization, but it's the one that exists within the academic literature, and I think it's very good, actually, although I sort of tweak it a little bit in my book. But nonetheless, the basic encapsulation of it is right, which is the vast majority of Salafis are quietists. And what they're really worried about and focused on is themselves. They're worried about self-purification, self-perfection. They're worried about their own mortal soul. They're worried about getting themselves into heaven, getting their family and kids into heaven, and they're really not that concerned about you. And that's the vast majority of Salafis. Not a problem per se. Then there's another group of Salafis, and these Salafis really emerged more, you could say, in the late 80s and early 90s, as in response to political events as they began to emerge in the Middle East. And I think they're probably actually the most interesting subset of the entire Salafi movement. And they're the politicos. And what I mean by that is that they are very politically engaged. They challenge the status quo. They challenge the governments in their countries. They call for reform. They call for political activism. But they also counsel against having people go out on the streets. So when the Arab uprisings started to sweep across North Africa, for example, very prominent activist Salafi sheikhs within Saudi Arabia, for example, people like Salman al-Auda, if you're familiar with Salafi actors, is a very prolific and important individual within Saudi, for example, who had previously been to prison for his challenge against the Saudi government and for his one-time relationship with Osama bin Laden, although he moved away from that later on. For these guys, they said to the Saudi government, they said, the onus is on you and the pressure is on you to give people reforms. And these reforms include giving people greater license for freedom of speech, a greater free press, restoring human rights, an independent and fair judiciary, all these kinds of things, saying you have to give people these concessions. At the same time, they said to the people, the responsibility is on you not to come out on the streets and to cause social discord, because they place a tremendous premium, as I say, on keeping social stability and on not challenging the status quo in a way that rips society apart. So they want to lobby and activate the government without causing a direct confrontation. It was the most interesting set of discussions that took place from these guys, because they were saying to both sides, listen, you both have rights and responsibilities, but ultimately they put the onus back on the government and said, if you don't give reforms, you can't hold this tide back forever. And when the dam bursts, the responsibility will be yours. And these guys are very, very interesting. They talked about the European revolutions of the 19th century. They talked about the French Revolution. They talked about the sort of evolution of rights and of law in the West. And they talk about these things saying, look, these have to come eventually to the Arab world and to the Muslim world. So it's coming from Salafis, people you wouldn't think are ordinarily thinking about, engaging with these issues, but they're saying this has to happen. You can't stop time progress, but it has to happen in an incremental way. And that duty and responsibility for the incremental change lies on both sides. So they are a smaller subset. They're not as large as the quietists, as I mentioned, but they are nonetheless an important and I think ultimately are going to be increasingly important group within the region. And as I say, the most interesting of the political concentration exists within Saudi Arabia, although it's not exclusive to that country. And then you have the final set of Salafis, and these are the jihadis, who challenge everything. For them, there's a complete rejection of the existing order, both within their own countries and within the international system. Their own governments are illegitimate and heretical, but so too are all systems that exist within the international structure. The United Nations is a tool of the West, and crusaders and Zionists and so on to oppress Muslims and so on. So there is a rejection of all of these things for them. And essentially what they wish to do is to uproot and to overturn fundamentally in every way the essence of these states, to implement and to impose a puritanical Islamic system that they do. So here I'm just showing you an individual from within the sort of Saudi tradition there of a loyalist. Now that works for the Saudi state because of the unique way that Saudi Arabia is run between a ruling pact between the House of Saud and the clerical establishment, which takes care of domestic issues and social affairs within the country, whilst the royal family takes care of foreign affairs and the economy and so on. But as I say, this is a broader spectrum here, which has given power to these individuals. And it's really the Salafi jihadis that I'm most interested in, and of course what I've subsequently written a book about. And what I've really wanted to do was to show the contours of the debate, and that's why it's the history of an idea. It's an intellectual history. It's not a history of people and Bin Laden meeting with Zarqawi or something like that, and what was discussed at that meeting and so on. What I want to say is, and what I sort of, in essence, am trying to do is to give the sort of prelude or the precursor to the horror you see today. When these guys from Islamic State first declare an Islamic State, or when they chop the heads off Western news reporters, or they put a Jordanian pilot in a cage and burn him alive, all of these things are grotesque and barbaric to us, but none of it is whimsical from their perspective. All of this comes from a reasoned position. All of this has been thought out and considered. And so what I wanted to do was to show the contours of the debate, and want to show those contours of that debate without making value judgments about it per se. So it's to show that how do you have a debate from the clerical establishment of the Saudi regime saying this is completely wrong, to the same guys on the opposite side using the same verses of the Quran or Hadith or whatever it is within the Islamic legal tradition to say, no, you're completely wrong, and in fact, the complete opposite is true, and this is the correct understanding. And so it's really about passing out and showing where the debate stands and how these bits of theology and argumentation have taken place. And I think it's the best way to try to begin to understand some of the ideas behind what's driving these individuals, behind what's happening today. Because, like I said, none of this is purely whimsical. It has a rationality and a thinking behind it, which makes sense to these types of people in order to keep them going. In that context, it's also worth just saying very briefly that the term Wahhabi gets used here a lot and interchangeably. And the way I suggest that you think about this is that Salafism is a philosophy, like we discussed. It's that attempt to emulate the Islam of the first 3 generations, that golden era. So that's the ideal. We want to go back and live that kind of Islam. And Abdul Wahhab, he in theory basically theorized one of the ways to realize that philosophy. So he essentially laid down a methodology for its realization. Now, he's not the only person to have done that. There are other ways, in theory, you could try to realize the Salafi ideal. It's just that the Wahhabi tradition is the most well-known because it's been adopted by the Saudi state and therefore has been proliferated around the world. So it's not quite the same to be a Salafi and to be a Wahhabi. But most Salafis follow a Wahhabi method in terms of their attempt to realize that ideal or to grasp the Salafi practice of Islam in that way. So it's an important piece of sort of, I suppose, nuance within that broader discussion debate about what Salafism is and how its ideals are realized. So what I've said is, and what I've theorized in essence when I've looked at the Salafi jihadis, is that there are 5 core ideas that make you a Salafi jihadi. And these ideas are not particularly contentious within normative Islam, nor are these ideas particularly different from what mainstream Muslims might think. But What is unique, or what I've attempted to do, is to show you what is unique about their understanding of these ideas. What's unique about the way the Salafi Jihadi movement has treated these ideas, the way they've evolved them, and the way they've developed them, or sort of weaponized them for the modern era. And before I go into that, I think this is the sort of time to make this point. What I found, and I think what I found very surprising, was that this is a very modern movement. This is a very modern thing as far as I'm concerned. And even Salafi, self-identification as Salafi Jihadi, when you do just a text search to see when they started referring to themselves, you do find the odd reference to it in the 1990s, but really, it begins to crystallize into something identifiable, as something almost vaguely tangible as a result of the 2003 Iraq War. And that's the point. The war drives all of this. War and times of crisis and calamity are the real moments of drive and change and intellectual evolution. So that I think the other points I make are that the early 90s are an important point. You have the war in Algeria, but also Saudi Arabia goes through a unique crisis as a country at that moment, because for the first time, Saudi Arabia is forced to confront itself and to discuss amongst itself what it means for Saudi to be a Saudi state. Because what happens, of course, is once Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, the Saudi state invites the United States to come to the Arabian Peninsula and defend the kingdom against Iraq. And that discussion about what's our relationship with the West, is it allowed to have American troops on the Jazirat al-Arab, on the Arabian Peninsula, which is regarded as being holy soil, was a real turning point, and you'd never had public dissent until that point. And so it becomes this moment of real theological innovation and change and development of new ideas to start to sort of crystallize and form in a new fashion. So in that context, the idea is that the 5 things I think you need to believe in, and these are essentially the chapters of the book, so you don't have to read it. But I would like it if you bought it. So is jihad, obviously. And we basically know what jihad is, right? It's a physical struggle. And I make the point that, yes, jihad has a linguistic meaning, as a lot of these terms do within Arabic. They have linguistic meaning, but they also have a legal meaning. And broadly, it's very, very broadly accepted that the legal meaning of jihad is to fight. And yes, the linguistic meaning, excuse me, the legal meaning, linguistic meaning, sorry, is to struggle and to exert effort, but the legal meaning is to fight. So jihad is one. Takfir is the second concept. That's really the process of excommunication. And it's declaring other people non-Muslims, and therefore licensing strife and war and sort of combat and confrontation against them and with them. And that's really what has been at the heart of driving the sectarian conflict within the Levant at the moment. So that when ISIS or Al-Qaeda or various others attack Shia shrines, or indeed when Hashd al-Shabi goes and attacks Sunnis, when they're attacking each other, they're really declaring the others as not being real Muslims under the principles of takfir. So this is an idea that really stretches back again to the very earliest parts of Islam, that has been developed and I think weaponized in a unique fashion in the modern era to give license to these movements, again, within the very specific political context in which they operate. Then the other concept, the third one I address, is al-wala wal-bara. And this is a really much more difficult concept to explain, so I'm trying to do it relatively swiftly. But in essence, it sort of means peace and love for the sake of God, or peace and hate, or love and hate, I should say, for the sake of God. And the way you might think about this is George Bush after 9/11, you're with us or you're against us. That's essentially what it is. Where's your loyalty and allegiance? So that wala, your love and everything, is for the believers. It's for Islam, it's for Muslims, right? So again, if I give you a sort of caricatured example of this, if you think about Anjem Chowdhury when he might go on the news after some atrocity, right? He'll say, I never criticize a Muslim. I'll never criticize, even when after the 7/7 bomb, he said, I won't criticize these individuals. They had their reasons and so on. He's basically saying, I'm giving wala to them. I'm establishing my loyalty with them. I stand with them. And the flip side of that is to make bara. Right? To say, I won't stand with the British government. I won't do anything the government ever asked me to do. I won't phone in to the police if I think someone's acting suspicious, because I'm making bara from the state. So it's essentially establishing where you stand. And it's a very powerful tool, again, when deployed politically, which it really hadn't been until the 19th century. Until then, it's more an issue of personal conduct. Right? The way you dress, the way you pray, and these kinds of distinguishing yourself as a community of believers. But it starts to become a politicized and political concept in the 19th century. It's deployed for political ends to say, don't form an alliance with that tribe. You owe Muslims your loyalty. Don't form an alliance with these people, they're enemies. And so it's basically about creating an in-group of supporters against an out-group, othering of other people, and in order to create and license sort of solidarity or communalism amongst this in-group and stuff. And so it's very interesting where I talk about how Al-Qaeda begins to try and demand this from Muslims in the post-9/11 context, to say, we are owed wallah from everybody. Why are we being denied this? And stuff. So that's that concept. That's the third one. Now, fourth one is Tawheed. Now, every Muslim believes in Tawheed. And Tawheed is fundamentally, just to boil it down, it's basically the core essence of Islam. It's the core essence of I wonder if I can go backwards. Yeah, it's that. It's belief in one God. And that's basically the message of Islam. It's worth saying, this is not the ISIS thing. Right? All Muslims believe in things. So when people say that's the ISIS thing, it's not. I mean, ISIS have co-opted it, unfortunately. But all Muslims believe in the idea of Tawheed. So why is it in the book? It's a difficult thing to put in because all Muslims believe this. You can't be a Muslim if you don't believe in Tawheed, right? It's the monotheistic message. But the reason I put it in is because, again, the Salafi-jihadi movement uniquely conceptualized the idea of Tawheed in a way that other Muslims haven't. And so I discussed that part of it, which is they said, to truly demonstrate your devotion to God, to truly demonstrate your belief in Tawheed, because it's quite an abstract concept, right? You sort of have to believe in it intellectually. So how can you physically manifest? He said, yeah, of course you can do the ritualistic stuff. You can pray and you can fast and so on. But how do you show God you've truly given yourself to him in every way? And so Muslims believe in predestination. The moment of your death is written. Right? It's already been prescribed for you. And the Quran says that no matter what you do, you can't move the time backwards or forwards. So Abdullah Azzam, who led the Arab Mujahideen in the 1980s against the Soviet Union, he says, how could you possibly demonstrate your belief in this verse unless you come to the battlefields of jihad, when bullets are whizzing all around you and you know they won't hit you unless it was prescribed for you to die at that moment anyway? And so it's a very interesting way of basically saying, you can't be a real Muslim unless you come and fight jihad. You can't realize the fundamental nature of what it is to be a Muslim, right? The first part of the Islamic testament of faith, of the Shahada, if you don't come and embrace the message of Tawheed on the battlefield. So it's a very unique idea, and so I wanted to explore that and discuss that in that concept. And the final point is that of Hakimiyya. And Hakimiyya is about governance. It's about having a state. It's about having an Islamic society that is governed by a system of Islamic rules under an Islamic system or an Islamic state, by whatever conception or construction that such a state might look like. And the really interesting thing about this idea is that with the other four ideas, I essentially trace all the genesis of those ideas to political events and to happenings in the Arab world. Right? So it's really a story of what's happening in Saudi, in Egypt, to a lesser extent maybe Algeria and Jordan, but it's an Arab story. It's about what's happening in the Arab world. But when it comes to Hakimiyya, Hakimiyya is really born from the Muslim struggle for independence in British India. It has its roots and genesis in that moment under colonialism in British India. And Maududi, who you may have heard of, but he's really the single most theorist coming out of the Indian subcontinent at that time. He theorizes and thinks through a lot of this idea about Islamic governance and influences. Perhaps the most important person he could have possibly influenced was Sayyid Qutb. And that's when the idea is then transposed back into the Arab world and starts to take root from there and to come back within the sort of broader body of Salafi jihadi ideas that are existing there. But essentially, its genesis lies in the Indian subcontinent. I just thought it was interesting. And I thought it was an interesting sort of aside to this broader picture that we see. And so the Hakimiyya aspect of it becomes particularly interesting. So I'm going to basically wrap up with just a few quick words about ISIS and where ISIS is today. Is ISIS a Salafi jihadi movement? I gave this book to a friend of mine to read, and who I sort of want to use as a guinea pig. I said, he's a sort of intelligent non-expert, so I said, tell me what you think of it. And he said, you've got to throw more ISIS in. You've got to throw more. And that's the interesting point. Where does ISIS sit today? And the interesting thing is I wanted to do that as well. ISIS is very different. There's a lot of Al-Qaeda in this book. And in a way, like I said, this is the prelude to what's happening today. It explains the backstory to how we got to the nightmare that's unfolding in the Levant today. So there's loads of Al-Qaeda, but it's interesting because Al-Qaeda produced a vast body of scholarship. I'm not saying it was good scholarship. I'm not saying I agree with it. What I'm saying is they produced a vast body of quite dense and detailed religious material to try and posit themselves as a movement within a broader spectrum of Islamic scholarship and Islamic tradition. They tried to claim the legacies of important figures from Islamic antiquity, such as Ibn Taymiyyah, and to say, you know, they're the true heirs of these traditions. Islamic State doesn't really do any of that. Islamic State produces short, sharp, 4 or 5 minute glossy videos that are fundamentally designed to recruit. It does not have a sophisticated theology that at least it puts out in the public domain. And I really tried hard to find a book. I said, where are their books? You don't find them. The manuals that get leaked online, they're operational things. So administrative documents about how to run a state. There isn't a really detailed discussion of theology. Al-Qaeda would produce a book for anything. So their policy of sort of indiscriminately bombing marketplaces in Iraq in 2003, 2004, 2005, produced a 100-page booklet discussing that. ISIS burns a man in a cage, they produced a paragraph to justify it. And so it's a very interesting moment to look at Islamic State and whether they are really a Salafi jihadi movement, whether they will innovate this doctrine in a way. And I kind of conclude the book by really saying the biggest theological innovations and evolutions in Salafi jihadism today continue to come from Al-Qaeda, which I believe in Syria and Iraq is starting to demonstrate greater theological pragmatism than it has done in the past. I think it's almost softening some of its understandings. And so we're living in this kind of peculiar situation and moment right now with this ideology, I suppose, that is undergoing a period of tremendous mutation in the Syrian and Iraqi conflicts, as it will do, because these conflicts have always been the moments of evolution for it. But it'd be interesting to see what happens next. But I would keep your eyes on Al-Qaeda rather than ISIS for the next evolution of Salafi jihadism.